much effort in recent years to make available opioid products that are difficult to abuse, in the hope of stemming or even turning the tide of abuse-related problems that is afflicting so many societies and ruining so many lives. In this webcast, I'm going to briefly review progress to date and ask a key question. Okay, so who actually wants abuse-deterrent opioids, and why? Throughout this presentation, I will refer to abuse-deterrent formulations, ADFs, the FDA's preferred term, but many refer to them as tamper-resistant formulations, or TRFs. In my view, the latter are a subset of ADFs, being those that can be shown to be difficult to tamper with, whereas ADFs overall have as their intended objective a demonstrable impact on behaviour, which is of course a lot harder to show. It is quite clear that the dramatic increase in the consumption of prescription opioids in the United States during the first decade of this century, coupled with their propensity for being abused, has produced a catastrophic, greater than fourfold increase in overdose admissions and deaths. It would seem to be, self-evidently, a good idea to try and identify ways in which this trend could be contained and even reversed. And the ambition to produce opioid formulations that are more difficult to abuse is one that can be shared by most, if not all, stakeholders. It is also an interesting conundrum that the stakeholder group most at risk from abuse is the one that is actively opposed to, or at least intent on circumventing, the impact of abuse-deterrent formulations. However, the actions of the other principal stakeholders, regulators, pharma companies, patients and payers, are interesting to consider. The United States, sadly, leads the way in experiencing the effects of widespread opioid abuse, and it is the FDA that has spearheaded the drive to encourage the development of ADFs and their use in clinical practice. Their guidance documents on the topics of assessing abuse potential and developing ADFs have provided industry with a much needed indication of what is required to gain labelled claims in this area. However, the guidance is still rather vague on what constitutes meaningful abuse deterrence. Their approach, which seems to be, well, we'll know it when we see it, is understandable but hardly informative. Latterly, the agency has also been attempting to grasp the thorny issue of ADFs for generics, recognising that while standard generics remain so much cheaper than the new ADF products, uptake is going to be seriously hampered. The FDA is offering 4 levels of labelling for claims of abuse deterrence, grouped according to the source and type of data. At the bottom of the scale, Tier 1 merely recognises that the physical characteristics of the product make it more difficult to tamper with. Tier 2 recognises that these innovations have been shown to beneficially impact drug exposure when tampering does occur, while Tier 3 products have demonstrated a reduced potential for abuse through clinical drug-liking studies performed in experienced drug abusers. The ultimate objective, however, is Tier 4 labelling, which would state that real-world use of the product has been shown to lead to an actual reduction in abuse. Unfortunately, however, these initiatives do not appear to have produced the intended supportive environment for ADF development and use. Only 5 products have so far been approved in this manner, none at Tier 4, and the as yet unresolved issue of cheap non-ADF generics continues to prove a major barrier to further progress. Nevertheless, it cannot be denied that the FDA really has been trying to facilitate the introduction of ADFs. In Europe, however, the situation is radically different. While one must concede that the clinical and social problem is undeniably less acute than in the States, is it not merely a matter of time before we catch up? We usually do in most things. EU regulators appear not only to fail to recognise such abuse as being a major issue in terms of the regulations and their advice on them, they also appear to refuse to acknowledge it in the labelling they approve. By way of example, it is interesting to note that the naloxone component of the proprietary oxycodone-naloxone combination that is approved for pain relief in both the US and the EU is labelled in the US as having abuse deterrence potential, with no mention of any effect on constipation risk. Whilst in the EU, it is specifically noted to have the potential to reduce the risk of constipation, but with no mention at all of any abuse deterrent properties. Quite an extraordinary divergence, considering that it is the same product. The pharma industry initially responded enthusiastically to the prospect of carving a slice out of the $7 billion US opioid market and $50 billion globally, with numerous proposed products intended to deliver the desired impact on abuse potential. Various formulatory approaches and even fundamental molecular innovations have emerged in pursuit of this goal. But following numerous rebuffs from the FDA, mostly over labelling, many of the bigger players have started walking away from the concept, apparently disillusioned by both the stringency with which the new guidance is being interpreted and the lack of progress in addressing the commercial issues that hamper ADFs post-approval. The admittedly somewhat partisan Branded Industry Working Group last year declared that Tier 4 labelling is, to all intents and purposes, inaccessible, and that the commercial challenges must be addressed if ADFs are to successfully deliver what is required, with no further approvals for non-ADF products and critical re-evaluation of current ones. One fears that unless this changes, for the industry it will be a case of thanks, but no thanks. Patients, meanwhile, appear to be having their own problems with ADFs. Most do not appear to consider diversion and abuse as their problem, even though it usually is they and their friends or relatives who are doing the diverting and abusing, and they have reported tolerability and efficacy problems. The major issue is, however, an economic one. Those who are struggling to meet the cost of their medications are understandably unhappy about paying more for ADFs in order to prevent other people from abusing them. It has been noted, however, that gaining an understanding into the real impact of these issues is impeded by the recognition that many who complain may be doing so because they themselves have an abuse problem, the satisfaction of which is being impaired by the introduction of ADFs. Next, we turn to the payers, whose eternal vigil to minimise the spiralling costs of healthcare, let's be charitable, inevitably leads them to resist the introduction of expensive brands where cheap generics will do. In the US, of course, there is the added bonus that they rarely have to pick up the tab for the resultant adverse health effects. Most opioid abusers will either have no insurance or have abuse-related problems excluded from cover. Legislation is being proposed to address these issues, but is far from universally supported. So, what has been achieved so far? Are ADFs managing to turn the tide? Well, at first glance, there is some cause for optimism. Over the last 4 years, prescription opioid-related deaths do appear to have at least plateaued, if not actually fallen, despite the patchy ADF penetration of the market. Would not a greater enforcement of their use produce yet greater gains? Well, perhaps. Unfortunately, however, there is strong evidence that while prescription drugs may be becoming less lethally abusable, drug abusers are not reducing their abuse. They are merely switching products. Recent data indicate that heroin-related deaths are rising, and even with prescription opioids, abusers are switching to non-extended release products, where ADFs are less prevalent. So, here we see the fifth group of stakeholders, the abusers themselves, voting with their feet. It is hardly surprising that they don't appear to want ADFs, but as discussed in this presentation, not many of the other stakeholders really appear to value them either. Is it worthwhile pressing ahead with ever greater efforts to make opioids harder to abuse? Or might policies that tackle the fundamental problem, the propensity for some humans to address their problems through inappropriate drug use, be ultimately more likely to succeed? At Transcript, we have vast experience of evaluating new products, of all shapes and sizes, and in a variety of therapeutic areas. This expertise extends from R&D right through to commercial evaluation, ensuring that your product's potential is given full measure.